Welcome back to Management 2020. The goal of this video is to talk about intercultural communication and its connection to business communication. So in the video, we'll talk about the need for intercultural competence and differentiate between monocultural, multicultural, and intercultural groups. We'll talk about culture shock, differences in management style between groups and cultures. We'll define ethnocentrism and how it creates a problem for intercultural competence, and then talk about how to become an interculturally competent business professional. So why do we need intercultural competence? Well, we need it because we live in an increasingly globalized world where we're interacting in business contexts with people who come from a variety of backgrounds. And so we can't assume that they have a shared set of practices, a shared set of values, a shared set of understanding that exists with our exact culture. And as businesses engage in more international ventures, whether it's having international people work here in the United States, or whether it's someone from the United States who's sent to go work with a partner in another country, there's lots of interaction, especially with the use of technology, that it makes it easier to interact with people around the world. And as there is a need and a desire for commodities and services that don't exist within one region, then there's a need to cooperate and interact with people in the other regions so that we can exchange those commodities and services around the globe. So because organizations are intercultural, the people who work in those organizations also need to become interculturally competent. So these diagrams here try to illustrate the differences between a monocultural society where everyone has a shared set of practices and understanding, and they may interact with each other, but there isn't a need for developing intercultural competence because everyone has this shared general cultural understanding. Some cultures are multicultural. So there's people from many different cultures, but there's not much interaction between them. I experienced this once when I worked at a university that had over 50% international students. And in general, it was a good intercultural situation. But the multicultural aspect of it was really highlighted when I would go visit the cafeteria on campus. And every table had a different cultural group. There was the Tongan table, there was the Samoan table, there was the Korean table and the Filipino table. Lots of cultures, but they weren't interacting with each other when they would eat their meals. They just wanted this comfortable place to be surrounded by other people who had that shared cultural understanding. But a truly intercultural situation involves people from a variety of backgrounds interacting with each other. And this is what we see increasingly in the business world is intercultural workplaces. And because of that, we need to develop this skill of intercultural competence. It may be helpful for us to take a moment and talk about the concept of culture shock. So as people move from one culture to another, they can experience culture shock. Culture shock is the difficulties that we experience when we moved from our home culture to a new culture. And this doesn't have to involve international travel. When people move from one culture to another culture within their own country, they can experience this. SUU students even experience this. Many who maybe aren't from Cedar City or rural southern Utah come to live in Cedar City and find that it takes an adjustment. We also see this in the workplace, moving from one organization to maybe another business that has a different set of corporate cultural practices, and we can also experience culture shock. So this diagram here tries to show our level of happiness versus the time we spend in the culture. And in the beginning, there tends to be this, what's called the honeymoon phase. There's lots of excitement, anticipation of this new culture and the promises of the things that it will bring. And so happiness levels can really increase. But at a certain point, we start to recognize that despite the good things it has, it's not familiar. And we may miss some of the things from our previous or our home culture. And so our happiness level can drop. And this happens a lot to maybe international students that go to live in another country. It's exciting at first, but very quickly they realize the food is different. The language might be different. The expectations for students and social interaction is different, and everything just seems harder to do. And because of that, happiness levels can drop quite low. And some people, it drops so low and it stays low that they will abandon the intercultural or the international experience and return home. People may leave a business because they move to a new organization that's a different culture and they can't adapt and they just give up and they quit. But what we hope is that people can accept that, yes, this is different from what I'm familiar with, but it has some positives and I can learn to adapt to the things that I find difficult. If we can do that in that period of adjustment, experimentation, then we become adaptive. We've learned how to function in both cultures, and we can recognize the value of both cultures. So I bring this up to help us realize that if we are dealing with new team members that come from a culture that's different than our team culture, we may need to provide them support and time to adjust. But same thing, if we travel or we go to another culture, move to a new business, we're going to have to give ourselves some time to adjust. But recognizing that adjustment is possible and that it sometimes just takes time, we can be patient with ourselves and others as we experience culture shock. So some of the reasons why we may experience culture shock is a difference in practices and a difference in values. And I just wanted to highlight some of the cultural differences that the textbook highlights when it comes to business management styles. And so one of them is a collectivist style versus an individualist style. A collectivist style or value within a company believes that what we do what's best for the whole and not for the individual. If I do what's best for the whole, then I know that I'll be taken care of because I'm part of the whole. A different approach might say, well, I do what's best for me because I have a responsibility to ensure that I am happy and productive. And if I am happy and productive, then I will contribute to the community, and the community will be happy and productive if everyone is taking care of themselves. So this may display itself differently in practices within the company, where some people expect others to really be conscious of others. And some think that that's not necessarily important. As long as everyone takes care of themselves, everything will be good. And so when we encounter these differences in values and practices, we might experience some culture shock. Another difference is in communication styles, being very direct with communication or being more indirect, especially when it comes to maybe having to give negative feedback or constructive criticism. Some cultures are happy being direct and saying, here's a problem, let's fix it. Other cultures might not feel comfortable with that and they want to be more indirect. They'll leave subtle clues or hints or just not address problems. And there isn't a right or wrong here. There's just different styles, and we need to be prepared to adapt to those different styles. Another one here is high versus low power distance, right? In some organizations and in some cultures, the difference between someone in authority and someone who is beneath them is much greater, right? And so there isn't the ability to sort of reach up and speak to those in higher authority because you need to respect that power distance. Other cultures don't care so much about the power distance. You don't have to refer to authorities or people in leadership positions by titles. You can refer to them as if they were an equal. And so again, these differences can make people uncomfortable when they're used to one structure or one style and they move to another style. The last one here I just want to talk about briefly is the uncertainty accepting versus uncertainty avoiding people. So in some cultures, we just know that we won't always have the answer, and we can just be comfortable with that and just say, hey, things are unsure, but we can just adapt as we go along. In other cultures or other groups or other people, there is a desire to avoid that uncertainty. So there's more planning, there's more explicit rules to help control and plan for the future so that we're not dealing with as much uncertainty. Maybe you have to be more explicit with your team. You have to be more explicit with your manager. Whereas other groups are like, we can just work it out as we go along. So understanding that there are differences and that can cause that cultural shock or that cultural tension can help us recognize that it's okay that there are differences. And really, this leads into the concept of ethnocentrism. So, ethnocentrism is the belief that one's cultural values or practices is somehow the right one, or it's better than others. And so, you might see this sometimes when people travel to a new country and they're like, oh, they do this wrong here, or like, why do they do this? This is so stupid. My way's better. And they may not explicitly communicate that, but that is part of maybe their belief system that is governing the interactions they have with others. And so it can create these problems with prejudice, with miscommunication, with conflict when we deal with people that groups that have intercultural relationships. Because there may be, if we believe that, or a person, anyone in that group believes that their culture is better than others' culture, when they encounter cultural differences, then there's not an acceptance and maybe a curiosity and a willingness to be open to those differences, but then there's a judgment, and it creates more divides and more conflict between people. So we want to avoid ethnocentrism. It's okay to love one's culture, but we can't use our culture as a tool to force or discipline or control other people. So we need to develop intercultural competence. This is the way to overcome ethnocentrism. And here's a quote from Dr. Bennett, who says that intercultural competence is a set of cognitive, affective, and behavioral skills that support effective and appropriate interaction in a variety of cultural contexts. So if we want to become interculturally competent, we need to understand other cultures, we need to value them and accept them, and then we need to take care of practices, our interactions, our speech that encourages respectful and cooperative interactions when we're in these intercultural groups. Here is a diagram I like to use when I am teaching students and faculty on campus about developing intercultural mindset. And I tell them that it's a part of developing a mindset, our knowledge about other cultures and about cultural differences. Developing a heart set means valuing other cultures, being curious about them, trying to understand why their practices are tied to their values, and avoiding ethnocentrism. And then lastly, developing a skill set, right? Our abilities to interact with people, our abilities to communicate effectively and respectfully with other people. And as we develop a mindset, a heart set, and a skill set, we will be more competent as business communicators in intercultural contexts. So we've stated many times in this course, our goal is business communicators is to be clear, concise, and audience focused with our communication. Our intercultural competence will help us choose words that are clear and concise and that convey the appropriate meaning, because we understand how our audience understands and uses words, so that we will have a shared understanding of how to communicate effectively. But we also, a key idea of being audience focused, understanding what our audience values, how they prefer to communicate, and what their background knowledge is, will help us craft messages and communication that is appropriate for that interaction. So in this video, we talked about the need for intercultural competence. We looked at different types of cultural situations, how culture shock can impact how someone's effective in a new culture. We looked at differences in management styles, the dangers of ethnocentrism, and lastly, some parting tips for developing intercultural competence.